Hi there, it's Miss Christy again. Nice to see you. I've got another Little Miss and Mr. book I want to read you. It's called Mr. Noisy by Roger Hargreaves. And while I read the story, my dogs are here too. Chachi, say hi. And Ruby is over here. Say hi. Okay, let's get to the story. Mr. Noisy. Mr. Noisy was a very, very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy were reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But achoo! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now this story starts with Mr. Noisy asleep in bed in his bedroom in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, it's a snore worth hearing. It sounds like a herd of running elephants. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, he shut the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high up above wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed to Mrs. Crumb the baker. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him the meat. Well, afterward, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy. Absolutely, but what? Asked Mr. Bacon. I know. And she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon grinned a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went down to Wobbletown to shop. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread. Sorry, can you please speak up? She said, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread. I can't hear you, said Mrs. Crumb. Ugh, Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Then he went into Mr. Bacon's butcher shop. I'd like a piece of meat. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I said I'd like a piece of meat. What's that, you say? Asked Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up, and he went home, and he went to bed, hungry. No food. Well, the next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice again. And then he stopped and he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did. I said I'd... And then he stopped and he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off for home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. And then he stopped and he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never, ever tried before, and it was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and you know what he thought and did? He opened the door very quietly, and he stepped inside, and he shut the door very gently. Quiet and gentle were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either, and they were fun too. And do you know something? Mr. Noisy isn't as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has even learned how to whisper. Well, thanks for listening to this story. We'll see you next time. Chachi, say bye. And Ruby? Ruby looks tired. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.